What's up, my homies? Hope you're having an awesome day. Today, what we get to talk about is our next kind of element of fiction. And so far, we've talked about characters, we've talked about setting, and so today we're going to spend some time talking about conflict. And conflict is one of my favorites because I think it's one of the easiest ones to pick out if you know exactly what it is that you're looking for. So we'll jump right into it. So the first question is, what is conflict? If I tell you that you are having a conflict with someone, or two people are having a conflict with one another, or I have a conflict in my schedule, what am I talking about when I'm talking about a conflict? Well, conflict is just a fancy word that means problem. So, when we're talking about conflict in a story, we're talking about the problem of a story. So, when you're looking for the conflict in a story, we're looking for what is the big problem. And the cool thing about conflict in a story is we can kind of separate it. We can kind of figure out what type of conflict it is. There are different types of conflict. And so that's what our goal is going to be. It's going to be able to read a story or a passage and figure out what type of conflict it is that we're talking about. This is an important fact right here, though. Without conflict, without a problem in the story, there would really be no story at all. There has to be conflict in order for there to be plot, in order for there to be a story. In other words, think about it like this. What if? What if Goldilocks thought that the three bears were cuddly and cute and they got along perfectly? Or what if Cinderella's stepmother had just let her go to the ball? Didn't tell her she had to stay home. What if she had just let her go? What if the three pigs and the big bad wolf were best friends? They hung out all the time. No big deal, right? Or what if Harry Potter's parents had never died? Voldemort had never killed Harry Potter's parents. Or here's a good example. What if Augustus' face in the story Wonder would have been completely normal? If all of those situations would have been true, then we would have never had those stories. We know that the opposite is true. Goldilocks and the three bears did not get along. She kind of broke in and stole things. Cinderella's stepmother was evil, wouldn't let her go. The big bad wolf was trying to eat the pigs and blew their house down. Harry Potter's parents were killed by Lord Voldemort. August has a problem with his face, and so he has to deal with all these issues. So the point is, if there was no conflict in a story, there really wouldn't be much of a story at all. You'll never read a book and it'll say, once upon a time there was a little boy who lived a perfect life, the end. Okay? There wouldn't be any story there. I tell my students all the time, think about every TV show or movie that you've watched or even book that you've read. Things always seem to go wrong, right? Things always seem to get worse and worse and worse until we reach our climax a lot of times in the story and things start to get a little better. So you have to have a conflict, you have to have problems, there has to be conflict. Every story has a conflict to it, a problem. So let's look at the different types of conflict. So we're really going to look at four major types of conflict. There are more, just so you know, but we're going to look at the four major ones that you will come across. And if you look here, you can see that we separate conflict into two categories. We have what we call external conflict and we have internal conflict. Okay? The word external means outside and the word internal means inside. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about the two major types of conflict. We're going to look at three types of external conflict or outside conflict, and we're going to look at one type of internal conflict. And so those are kind of the two major categories. The three types of external conflict that we're going to look at is we're going to look at man versus man. We're going to look at man versus society. We're going to look at man versus nature. And then the one type of internal conflict that we're going to look at is man versus self. Now, when we say man versus something, it doesn't have anything to do with being a boy or a girl. When we say man versus something, that first man that we're talking about is generally our main character. Okay? So what is our main character having to deal with, or our major characters having to deal with? Okay, so man versus either man versus society, man versus nature, or man versus themselves. Okay, so we have external conflict, we have internal conflict, And so now let's look at the four types and a couple of examples. So we'll start with man versus man. And man versus man is a very simple type of conflict. If the story you're reading has man versus man conflict, it means that the main character is having a problem with another main character. You see here, I have another human being. Think of man versus man as your typical superhero stories. Like you have your major main character, and they're having a problem with a villain. We've talked about these words before. You have a protagonist who is your main good guy, and they're going against your antagonist, right? Your main bad guy. Those are your man versus man stories. Again, like I said, think about your superhero and your villain. Okay? And your man versus man types of conflict, you generally have one major main character who's a good guy, and they're going against one major main character who is a bad guy. So if you're reading a story, you have one good guy and you have one bad guy, chances are that story has man versus man conflict. So let's look at a couple of examples. So here's one. It says Ryan and Devin always met at the finals of the spelling bee. Both had been practicing for months, and today they finally got to see who was the best. Okay? And so your main characters here are Ryan and Devin. Okay? Obviously, they're competing against one another. The conflict is between those two major main characters, and so this story would most likely have man versus man conflict. So, like I said, one good guy, one bad guy. For example, here. Let's look at this one. I saw my enemy standing across the field, and I knew what I had to do. I slowly clenched my fists and took off running towards him. Okay? Again, you have the major character, I, and then it says he has his enemy standing across the field. So again, you have a major character, their conflict, their problem is with another major character, good guy, bad guy. So this would be man versus man conflict. Okay? Here's another one. Jeremy and Joshua raced toward the finish line. Despite being friends their entire lives, today they knew one of them would have to be the loser. Okay, this is a small example. And this example is to show you that it's not always good guy, bad guy. That's just the best way to think about it. But you have two major characters. You have Jeremy, you have Joshua, and they're racing against one another. And so the conflict is between those two characters. And so this would be what we consider man versus man conflict. Okay? So man versus man is two characters, usually going to be human beings, but sometimes you have, those kind of crazy stories, especially when you're thinking about movies where your main characters might be animals or that kind of thing. But you have one major character going against another major character. Okay? Our second type is what we call man versus society. Again, I want you to remember this is an example of external conflict. So this is outside. That major character is going against somebody on the outside. In man versus society, your main character is having problems with a large group of people. Okay? So instead of it being one good guy against one major bad guy, you might have your one main character good guy against a large group of people. I will tell you, I tell my classes this every year. Man versus society is the most popular form of conflict today. Lots of the stories in the movies that you have seen are man versus society. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So one example would be like The Hunger Games, if you've seen those movies or read those books. Okay, in The Hunger Games, you have Katniss, this one major lead character, and she's going against all of society. She's going against the Capitol. She's going against the system. So Hunger Games, another one along similar lines, Divergent is another one. If you've ever seen The Fifth Wave is another one or read that. The Giver is another example. Man versus society is a very common type of conflict to see today. And a lot of times what you have is you have one major main character and they're trying to go against the system or society or this big group of people who's ruling people. So that's a way to think about it. as a lot of those popular movies that you see or those popular stories that you come across today. One major character going against a large group of people. So let me show you a couple of simple examples. So here's one. Jamie stared into the crowd of protesters. She knew she would have trouble convincing them all. So your clues here, you have Jamie, who's our main character. She would be our man, right? And she is going against the protesters. So a large group of people. This is man versus society. Here's another one. Just as he rounded the corner, he saw 6 black cars coming from all directions. I can't let them catch me here. Not like this, he said to himself, and took off running down the alley. So in this sample, again, you have your main character, and you have this group of people who are trying to chase him from all directions. And so this is what we would consider a man versus society passage. One main character against a group of people. One more. Everyone turned and looked as I raised my voice and stepped out of the crowd. I will not go, I said, finding strength in my voice. Everyone knew that when you turned 17, you had to go to the tournament. I decided to change that tradition. A lot of times in man versus society stories, you have this one major character and they're going against the tradition, the society, the way things have always been. And so this is, again, a man versus society. So man versus man, one character against another. Man versus society, one character against a group of people. The third example, and this is our last example of external conflict, is probably the easiest one. Man versus nature. Man versus nature is when your main character has conflict with nature. The best way to remember man versus nature these are your survival stories. Someone trapped on a deserted island, someone trapped out in the middle of the woods, someone being attacked by an animal. Those are all what we consider man versus nature. And you probably read some stories that way, like Hatchet is a good example. So let's look at a couple of examples of man versus nature. Here we go. Carlos was alone in the woods and the storm was slowly creeping in. If only he could find his way out. So we have our main character, Carlos. He's alone in the woods and he's trying to find his way out. We would consider this man versus nature. His problem isn't with another character. His problem isn't with a group of characters. His problem is with nature. So man versus nature. Let's look at this one. Randy ran as fast as he could away from the pack of dogs. He felt like he was flying. All he could see, however, was the giant wooden fence ahead. Same situation. It's just rather than a storm being the problem or being alone in the woods, this time we have a pack of dogs. Okay? So you got to think, if you see animals and they are truly animals and they're going against a character, think about the that recent movie where the guy gets in the fight with the bear. The Revenant is what it's called. That's man versus nature. So this will be a perfect example. Man versus nature. Main character against a pack of dogs, right? This one. It was my 4th day stranded on the island. I had managed to make a fire, but I still had not managed to find food to cook. I decided that today I was going to hunt. I took my knife and headed into the jungle. This is a perfect example of man versus nature. We got someone stranded on the island. Again, this is a survival story. His problem, the main character isn't with another guy. It isn't with a group of people. This one is man versus nature, right? So those are our 3 types of external conflict. Man versus man versus society, man versus nature. Now let's look at our internal conflict, which is man versus self. And man versus self, what you have is you have your main character and they're struggling with their own emotions and their own feelings. Okay? In other words, the big problem isn't with others, it's with their own emotions and their own feelings. So let's see if we can look at an example here. And that's why it's called internal conflict, because they're struggling within themselves, inside of themselves. So here we go. Candace knew she was supposed to tell the truth, but she couldn't make herself do it. This is man versus self. Candace isn't struggling with other people or nature or a group of people. She's struggling with, should I tell the truth or should I lie? That's man versus self. Here's another one. Mark looked at his lucky watch. He knew he could share it with the others on the trip, but he was too scared. Would they laugh at him? He decided it would be too embarrassing. So this one, we're dealing with a lot of emotions. So Mark is struggling within himself. This is what we consider man versus self, right? Let's look at one more. Jessie turned to run away. Just as she left, she heard something behind her. It sounded like crying. She knew she could get away, but she could not leave someone behind in the dark. She looked at the light ahead, but turned around to help the stranger. This is a good example because in this example, we do have our main character, Jessie, but we have this other character, the stranger. And so we have more than one character. And so a lot of times our mind will think, oh, more than one person is man versus man. But you got to remember that conflict is a problem. Okay? Is a problem. And so Jessie isn't having a problem with the stranger. They're not fighting against one another. Jessie's problem is that she knew she could get away, but she couldn't leave someone behind in the dark. And so Jessie has to make a decision here. Should I go stay and help or should I leave? And so this is an internal conflict. Okay, she's struggling with her own emotions. And so this is what we would consider man versus self. Okay? So here are the conflicts again. These are the different types of conflict. We have man versus man. Two characters, good guy, bad guy, a lot of times, superhero. Have man versus society, really popular form today. One major character trying to go against a group of people, the traditions, the society. Man versus nature, major character trying to survive in storms, deserted island, against an animal, those kinds of things. Those three are what we consider external. Our major character has to deal with something outside of themselves. And then our last example is man versus self. And this, again, is our internal conflict. They have to deal with their own emotions, how they're feeling, that kind of thing. Now, what's important to remember is that oftentimes if you're reading a long novel, there can be lots of different types of conflict. Like Wonder's a good example. In some chapters, August is dealing with himself, internal conflict. In some chapters, August is dealing with Julian being mean. That would be man versus man. So one story might have more than one type of conflict, but the goal is to be able to read something, read a passage, read a chapter, read a story, and know what kind of conflict it is that you're seeing. Just remember that conflict is the problem. Without conflict, there is no story, and we have 4 major types of conflict that we're going to be looking for. Awesome. Hope you have a great day. Keep reading. Proud of you.